The clerk looked at her wheelchair and shook his head before she'd even reached the counter. "Ma'am, standing steady for a long shot isn't something you can do from a chair," he said, loud enough for the whole store to hear. She didn't answer. She just wheeled forward and asked for a target set at 200 yards. Deacon's Firearms occupied a converted warehouse space on the edge of a mid-sized city, the kind of shop that had built a solid reputation over 3 decades on a mix of hunting supplies, competitive shooters, and a staff that prided itself, more than it probably should have, on reading customers accurately within the first 30 seconds of an interaction. Rifles hung along the walls in careful rows, hunting models mostly, with a smaller case near the register holding the shop's precision competition pieces. Wren Callahan rolled through the front entrance a little after noon on a quiet Tuesday, wearing a plain gray jacket and dark slacks, her wheelchair moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had operated it for years rather than months. She approached the counter directly, her eyes already tracking the rifle wall behind it with the specific attention of someone reading something they already knew well. Foster Deacon, the owner's nephew and a full-time clerk for the past 4 years, watched her approach and made his assessment before she'd said a single word. "Help you find something," he said, in the tone of someone expecting the answer to disqualify itself before it arrived. "The bolt action there," Wren said, pointing to a rifle mounted apart from the others, older, with a worn walnut stock. "I'd like to hold it." Foster glanced at her wheelchair, then at the rifle, then back at her wheelchair. "Ma'am, standing steady for a long shot isn't something you can do from a chair," he said, pitching his voice to carry across the store, where 2 other customers near the ammunition wall glanced over with the specific interest people reserve for a moment that promises to be at least mildly entertaining. "Most of our long-range customers need a stable standing platform. We've got some options that might work better for seated shooting, lighter calibers, shorter range." "I'd like to hold that one anyway," Wren said, without any particular heat in her voice. Foster hesitated, glanced toward the back office where the shop's owner was occupied with a supplier call, and lifted the rifle down with the exaggerated care of someone handling something he expected to immediately regret handing over. Wren took it, checked the chamber, verified the safety, and began breaking it down into its components with a fluency that had nothing hesitant in it at all, her hands moving through the sequence with the specific economy of someone who had done this exact thing considerably more times than a typical hunting customer ever would. "I'd like to see your range," she said, once she'd reassembled it. "Target at 200 yards. Foster's eyebrows went up. "Our line's set for 100 tops." "Then today's a good day to change that," Wren said. "If something about this woman's comm is already sitting with you the way it should, this is a good moment to send this video to a friend who needs to see what happens next." The range at Deacon's was modest, 6 lanes, adjustable rails that technically extended further than most staff bothered pushing them. Foster adjusted the rail with visible reluctance, and the 2 customers who'd been browsing the ammunition wall drifted back to watch, along with an older man near the register who had been quietly observing the entire exchange without saying anything at all. Wren wheeled to the firing line and locked her chair's brakes with a practiced motion, settling into a stance that used the chair's frame itself as her stability platform, her core engaged and braced against the seat back in a configuration that looked, to Foster's untrained eye, considerably less stable than the standing position he'd assumed was necessary for accuracy at that distance. She adjusted the angle of her hips slightly, a small correction that took only a few seconds but told anyone watching closely that this wasn't her first time solving this exact problem. Then settled the rifle's fore-end against a small padded rest clipped to the chair's armrest, another piece of equipment that clearly hadn't come standard with the wheelchair itself. She loaded 5 rounds, breathed once, went still, and fired 5 times in quick succession. Foster's first instinct was to look for 5 separate impacts. What he found instead, through the range's spotting scope, was a single ragged hole, dead center of the target, the kind of grouping that had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with a relationship to a rifle built over years most people never got the chance to have. The range went completely silent. The older man near the register, who had followed the group back to the range without anyone quite noticing him do it, stepped forward, his expression shifting into something considerably more careful than the mild curiosity he'd carried a minute earlier. That's not possible from a seated position, he said quietly, mostly to himself. Not at that distance. Not without a rest. Ren lowered the rifle, cleared the chamber out of old habit, and set it down on the range bench with the same unhurried calm she'd carried since wheeling through the front door. Subscribe. Actually, forget the formalities. Just stay with us, because what happens at the front counter over the next 20 minutes is the reason nobody at Deacon's Firearms has judged a customer by their wheelchair since. Ma'am, Foster said, his earlier dismissiveness entirely gone, replaced by something closer to genuine unease. How is that even possible from a seated position? Standing was never actually the source of the stability people assume it is, Ren said. It's core engagement and a consistent, repeatable platform. A chair can be exactly that, once you've built the discipline around it. It took me years to relearn what stability actually meant after the injury. Once you've relearned something like that at that level of necessity, it stops mattering whether you're doing it standing or seated. What kind of injury? Foster asked. Ren considered the question, weighing, the way she weighed most questions now, exactly how much of an honest answer the moment actually deserved. The kind that happens in places most people never hear about, she said. A long time ago. The older man had stepped closer during this exchange, studying her face with a specific intensity that had nothing to do with the shooting demonstration anymore. Say your name, he said quietly. Ren Callahan. Something in his expression cracked open slowly, the specific unraveling of a man encountering a piece of his own past he had never expected to find in a converted warehouse gun shop on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I served with a Callahan once, he said. A long time ago. We called her Anchor because nothing ever moved her once she found her position. There was an incident. Spinal injury during an extraction that went sideways. Command told us she'd never return to active duty. I heard she disappeared not long after that. Nobody ever confirmed where. You're Pruitt, Ren said. It wasn't a question. You used to complain about the mess hall coffee every single morning and never once stopped drinking it. Pruitt's composed, weathered face went through several rapid transformations before settling into something that looked, unmistakably, like decades falling away all at once. Nobody's called me that in 18 years, he said. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to be recognized by someone who thought they'd never see you again, stay with us. Because what happens over the next several minutes is going to change how everyone standing in this store understands what they just watched. They spoke quietly near the range bench for several minutes. The store's ordinary Tuesday rhythm resuming cautiously around them. Foster hovering nearby, with the specific uncertain posture of a young man recalibrating an entire framework of assumptions in real time. I looked for you, Pruitt said. After the injury, filed requests through channels that mostly went nowhere. Eventually someone told me, off the record, that pursuing it further wasn't going to end well for my own file, and I stopped. I've spent 18 years wondering if I stopped too easily. You didn't stop too easily, Ren said. I made myself very hard to find. That wasn't an accident, and it wasn't something any amount of persistence on your end would have undone. What actually happened? Pruitt asked. If you're willing to say. I heard 3 different versions over the years, and none of them ever quite matched. Ren was quiet for a moment, weighing the question the way she weighed most things now. The extraction point collapsed under fire, she said. I took shrapnel across the lower spine, getting the last 2 men out. Command's version focused on the mission outcome, which was successful, and left out most of what it cost to make it successful. I spent the first year afterward relearning things people don't usually have to relearn twice in one lifetime. The second year, I started relearning marksmanship specifically because I wasn't willing to let the chair be the reason I stopped being good at the one thing that had defined most of my adult life. Why now? Why walk into a random gun shop on an ordinary Tuesday? I moved to this city 2 months ago, Ren said. I saw the shop sign from the street and realized I hadn't held a proper rifle in longer than I'd like to admit. I didn't expect to find anyone I knew here. I definitely didn't expect it to be you. Foster, still processing both his own misjudgment and the specific, uncomfortable feeling of having badly underestimated a situation in a way that was only now becoming clear to him, found his voice again once the immediate reunion had settled into something quieter. I need to apologize, he said, for assuming you couldn't do what you just did. Ren looked at him, something gentler crossing her expression than the flat composure she'd carried through the entire demonstration. You made a judgment based on what you could see, she said. Most people do. The mistake isn't making the judgment. It's not staying curious enough to update it once the evidence changes right in front of you. I've got better evidence now. You do, Ren agreed. The shop's owner, a heavy-set man named Deacon himself, emerged from the back office once word of the afternoon's events reached him secondhand, and approached Ren with the specific, careful respect of a man trying to make up for an employee's mistake without fully understanding the scope of what that mistake had actually been. I understand my nephew gave you some trouble, he said. He gave me the same trouble most people give a stranger they've already decided they understand, Ren said. It wasn't personal. It's just common. I'd like to make it right somehow, Deacon said. We run a monthly clinic for adaptive shooters, veterans, and civilians both, people managing all kinds of physical circumstances the standard training material doesn't really address. We've never had an instructor who could speak to seated stability from real experience. Would you consider it? How long has the clinic been running without a proper instructor? Ren asked. 2 years, Deacon said. Started it after a customer, a young man who'd lost the use of his legs in a car accident, asked if we had anything. We didn't, so we improvised something, mostly borrowed material from adaptive archery programs that didn't translate especially well. I've always known it wasn't good enough. I just didn't know how to fix it. That's a common problem, Ren said. Most adaptive programs get built by people solving the problem from the outside instead of the inside. It usually shows, eventually, in how much slower people improve than they should. Ren looked at him, then at Pruitt, then at Foster, standing nearby with the specific chastened posture of a young man who had learned something considerably larger than he'd expected to learn on an ordinary Tuesday shift. I'll think about it, she said. It wasn't a yes. It also wasn't a no. If this story is hitting you the way it's hitting us, hit that like button, because what this one Tuesday afternoon actually set in motion is only getting started. She left Deacon's firearms a little after 2 that afternoon, wheeling out into the mild autumn daylight at the same unhurried pace she'd carried through every version of the visit, the specific rhythm of someone who had spent years learning that a body doesn't have to move the way it used to in order to still accomplish everything it's ever been asked to do. 3 weeks later, Ren returned to Deacon's for the shop's first adaptive shooting clinic, arriving early with a small collection of stabilization equipment she'd built and refined over years of solo practice, modified rests, chair-mounted supports, a system for breathing and bracing that she developed almost entirely through trial and error in the absence of anyone else who understood the specific problem she was solving. 6 participants showed up that first Tuesday evening, a mix of veterans and civilians managing circumstances ranging from spinal injuries to amputations to chronic conditions that made standard standing positions painful or impossible. Ren worked through each person's specific configuration individually, adjusting her general principles to fit bodies and equipment that varied considerably from her own. One woman, a retired teacher named Helena Novak managing chronic pain from a degenerative condition rather than a traumatic injury, arrived uncertain whether she even belonged in a room full of veterans, quietly explaining to Ren that her situation felt smaller, somehow less legitimate than what everyone else in the room had presumably been through. Pain that changes what your body can reliably do isn't smaller because of where it came from, Ren told her. The principles are the same regardless of the cause. We're solving for stability and repeatability, not for the story behind why you need them. Helena left that first session having fired her best grouping in over a decade, and returned every month afterward with the specific quiet loyalty of someone who had finally found a room where the explanation for her limitations didn't matter nearly as much as the solution did. One participant, a young veteran named Dario Vance who had lost the use of his legs 3 years earlier in a training accident, spent the first hour of the session insisting, quietly but firmly, that his case was different, that he'd already tried adaptive shooting and concluded it simply wasn't going to work for him the way it had before his injury. I did 2 sessions with a VA program 8 months ago, Dario said, arms crossed, watching Ren set up equipment with visible skepticism. Instructor kept telling me to just trust the process. I don't need encouragement. I need someone to tell me honestly whether this is actually possible or whether I'm wasting everyone's time being here. You're probably right that it won't look identical to what you used to do, Ren told him. It might be better in ways you're not expecting yet, or it might stay harder than you want it to be for longer than feels fair. The only way to actually know is to spend real time finding out, instead of deciding the answer from a distance based on one disappointing afternoon. That's not really an answer. It's the honest one, Ren said. I could tell you it'll definitely work, and that might get you through today's session with better morale. It also might not be true, and I don't build anything on things that might not be true. What I can tell you is that I sat exactly where you're sitting 8 years ago, certain the entire discipline had ended for me, and I was wrong about that. I can't promise you the same outcome. I can only show you the same starting point. Dario didn't leave that first session with dramatically different results than he'd arrived with. But he came back the following month, and the one after that, and by the fourth session, something in his grouping had tightened in a way that made him go quiet for a long moment before asking, very carefully, whether Ren thought he might eventually be ready to try a local match. Eventually, Ren said. Not yet, but eventually, if you keep showing up the way you have been. Pruitt attended every session Ren ran that first year, not as a participant, but as a quiet, steady presence near the back of the room, helping set up equipment, making coffee nobody had asked him to make, the specific loyal attendance of a man who had spent 18 years believing a door in his own history had closed permanently and had decided, once it reopened, that he wasn't going to let it close again through his own inattention. Foster, meanwhile, had become, within a year, the shop's most careful clerk, the specific carefulness of someone who had learned, on one memorable Tuesday, exactly how expensive a fast assumption could turn out to be. He sat in on several of Ren's clinic sessions himself, not as an instructor, but as a quiet observer absorbing lessons about stability and adaptation that had nothing to do with rifles and everything to do with how he approached every customer who rolled, limped, or otherwise moved through his front door in a way that didn't match his default assumptions. The clinic grew slowly over the following 2 years, word spreading through veterans networks and adaptive sports communities the same unhurried way most genuinely useful things tend to spread, without advertising, mostly through people telling other people about a woman who taught seated shooting stability like someone who had built the entire discipline from scratch because nobody else had bothered to. By the second year, Deacon's monthly clinic had grown from 6 participants to nearly 20, and Ren had begun training 2 of her earliest students, Dario among them, to help run sessions on the months she couldn't attend in person. Ren never fully explained, to anyone beyond Pruitt, the specific circumstances of the injury that had put her in that chair, or the specific work she'd done before it happened. She answered technical questions about stability and breathing and bracing readily, generously, with the patient thoroughness of a genuine teacher. She answered questions about her own history the way she'd answered Foster's on that first Tuesday afternoon, with just enough truth to be honest and just enough restraint to keep the rest exactly where it belonged. Foster kept a small handwritten note taped inside the register drawer for the rest of his time at the shop, for words in his own handwriting that nobody else ever asked about. Check the evidence twice. He never fully stopped making initial judgments about the customers who rolled, limped, or otherwise moved through his front door in ways that didn't match his default assumptions. Nobody entirely does. But he'd learned, on one memorable Tuesday, to hold those judgments loosely enough to let them go the moment better evidence arrived. Some people carry more than one kind of injury into a room, the visible kind and the kind nobody thinks to ask about. In some ordinary Tuesday afternoons, both of those injuries turn out to matter considerably less than what a person actually chooses to do despite carrying them. Ren had spent years relearning what her own body could still accomplish after an injury everyone assumed would end the one thing she'd built her entire identity around. It took one dismissive clerk and a rifle nobody thought she could shoot from a wheelchair to remind an entire city that the story a body tells at first glance and the story of what a person is actually capable of are rarely, if ever, quite the same thing. If this story kept you here until the very last word, share it with someone who needs a reminder that the parts of us that look like limitations from the outside are sometimes exactly the parts we've already learned, quietly and patiently, to build something entirely new around.